Hello, listeners. Welcome to our English program podcast, Kaleidoscope. Listeners, in our today's program, we have with us Priyamwada Redican Chakne, who is a poet, educator, translator, and also an illustrator. She has recently published a collection of poems titled Kavya Phule, which is an English translation of poems written by Savitribai Phule. So, in this first part of the program, we have a conversation with Priyam, and we will have a poetry performance by her in our next part of this program. So now let us have a chat with Priyam. So Priyam, the first thing I would like to ask you is, why spoken word poetry? Like, what got you interested in this genre of performance poetry, and how did you pursue that interest?
To answer your question, why spoken word poetry? Well, I believe spoken word has the power to truly connect to people. Take the Bhakti movement, for instance. It had spoken word at the core of it. It was essentially a gathering of poets singing protest songs. And their first act of radicalism was writing verse in the local dialect, using language that the masses could understand and relate to. I passionately believe poetry as an art form is meant to be spoken. It needs to be spoken and heard. Poetry is living communication between a poet and a living, breathing, involved audience. And since I grew up in Jesuri, which, as you know, is on the path of the Vari, naturally I grew up listening to kirtans and bharuds. They were my introduction to spoken word poetry. Reading Chokha Mela or Soirabai were my first real encounters with protest poetry. That's where it all began for me.
Wow, that's great. So tell us something about the poetry slams that you have participated in. Like, how have they contributed to your journey as a poet, and what is their contribution to spoken word poetry in general?
I think poetry slams or open mics in general are a great place to try out new material. It's only after a live performance that I truly understand the potential of a piece, or what it lacks for that matter. Also, just the coming together of people and the collective sharing is so important. Like I mentioned earlier, spoken word has the power to truly connect to people and lead entire movements, revolutions, if you may.
Okay. So, spoken word poetry is a very old form of art. Like, performance poetry has been maybe the oldest form of poetry. It is reviving itself again in this new age. So, what do you think is the role of social media platforms in this revival? Do you think that performance poetry has undergone some major changes because of these platforms?
It is undoubtedly an important tool for any artist to get their work out there to a wider, more accessible audience. But at the same time, it isn't easy. For me personally, I think it was more challenging to make reels out of the translations that I've done than to do the actual translations. Not everyone can keep up with the pace at which things are changing on the internet. And I think for me that it's okay. What's important is that I keep working on my craft, on my writing, on my performance. And remember that social media is merely a medium to get my work out there. It's not the end goal.
That's really nicely answered, Priyam. So, I would like to know, what role has Jesuri town played in your life as an artist? It is a place where you constantly hear devotional songs and people perform abhangas. So, how did that place influence you as an artist?
Growing up in Jesuri introduced me to a lot of folk performance art like Jagran Gundhar, Tamasha, or for being in such close proximity to Pune, even Natya Sangeet. My father even wrote plays for me when I was in school, plays with songs and dances and long poetic monologues, some of his own, some by Tukaram or Shakespeare. So yes, growing up where I grew up has influenced me tremendously as an artist. But also having my father as my first teacher, that has made a huge impact. Even today, whatever I write, he gets to see the dreadful draft zero. He is my first audience.
So, Priyam, I also have a theoretical question for you. Like, when you translate, how do you balance your own voice with that of the poet's voice?
I believe it's important to look beyond just the literal translation and try and understand the poetry, try and translate it, and try and translate the underlying context. Take, for example, this line from one of Soirabai's poems, Pahate pahane gele duri, which literally translates to I witness, and what I witness has taken me far. Now, as a translator, I have translated the same line as I witness you, and the sight of you has enlightened me so. Since I know this poem was addressed to Vitthala, since I know it talks about enlightenment, I took the poetic liberty to look beyond just the literal translation. Now, this is very tricky and you cannot do this with every line, and you have to approach it with a lot of care. Since this is not my poem, I am merely a translator. But at the same time, if I really want my audience to truly appreciate what Soirabai was trying to talk about and to truly understand it in a different language, in a different era, there are certain moments, certain lines where I need to bring in my subjective experiences or my voice. And I think it is unavoidable to a certain extent. And I also believe that it is necessary to a certain extent.
Okay, right. So, along with translating, you also do illustrations. So, tell us more about that. Like, how do you translate words into images? When you illustrate for other artists, like, what was your experience when you were illustrating your father's book, Rhinoceros Tales?
Rhinoceros Tales was probably the first time since I left school that I picked up a pencil and tried to draw something.
Okay.
My focus was more on writing and performing, but that book, my dad's book, and then also having Ovi took me back to drawing and painting. And I learned so much from watching her. Like when she draws, she's not thinking about what she's drawing. She's basically just enjoying the process of drawing or the process of putting paint on paper. And that's so wonderful. That's what I love most about drawing is most of the times when I'm drawing, I'm just drawing. I'm not at all worried about what I'm making or whether this is going to look good or not. Of course, if it is to be used in a book, I will take an outsider's opinion or many outside opinions. But that's just it for me. Drawing is just a lot of fun. And so far, it's only that.
Priyam, you have also moved into teaching now. So you have traveled like whole of India with your poetry, with your performances. And I'm sure that experience you must be using for your teaching. Do you think that poetry still ignites minds? And as a teacher, what are your observations about children and poetry? Do you think that poetry plays a specific role in the life and education of children nowadays?
I think creative writing is in essence a therapeutic process. It's a great way, of course, to teach children a new language, to build their vocabulary and so on. But what it really does is it gives children a voice. It gives them the confidence in a way to be original, which is usually something a traditional classroom doesn't allow. There's so much pressure on the teacher to cover the syllabus. There's so much pressure on the children to get everything right. Creative writing, or any creative expression for that matter, is a good break from all of that. A blank piece of paper that you can fill up with whatever you want. And as a teacher, I won't correct you. I won't use a red pen to change spellings or grammar even. Maybe towards the end I will, but not for the first few drafts. The first few drafts must be pure expression. They don't need to make sense even. And It's heartwarming to see how much children have to say, how much they want to share if they're not afraid of making mistakes, when they're not worried about getting it right.
That's great. So, Priyam, let's talk about your book, Kavya Phule. Savitribai Phule is more known for her social work than for her poems. So, what prompted you to translate her poems?
My father's library, which was a great source of entertainment for us as children, had all of these wonderful translations by Abbott, Tukaram, Eknath, Bahinabai. So when I came across Savitribai's poems, especially some of her bhakti poetry, I immediately started looking for translations to share with my father and so many other people in my circle. There were translations for some of her literature on the internet. I even found a book online, but it was out of print. So doing this book felt like the natural next step. It's an important collection, and I am lucky to have a wonderful support system who helped bring it to life.
Why do you think the narrative of Savitribai Phule's history focuses more on her social work? And how would you connect this particular narrative to the history of Indian women poets in general?
Savitribai Phule's contribution to the social reform movement in India is so vast that it naturally becomes the focus of who she was. That being said, I think there has been and still is a general lack of disrespect to any literature or art form in India that does not perfectly fit into what we've been told for so long is real literature or good art. Take the movie Sairat, for instance, which was a box office hit and an extremely well-made and important film, which spoke about caste oppression in modern India. But how long did it take us to make a film like this? How much did someone like Nagaraj Manjure have to struggle to come to a point where he could make a film like this? This is what happened to Savitribai's poetry. It was too radical. It spoke too loudly against tyranny.
Priyam, if you had to choose a poem from Phule's works that resonated with you, which would be that poem?
This is a difficult choice to make, but I think I'd choose poem 14, My Homeland, where she describes her maternal home, Naigaon. The poem very beautifully describes growing up in a Maharashtrian village in the countryside. And there's a line that I particularly relate to that goes, the 12 Balutas and 12 Alutas, so many castes and creeds in this land of Shivaji live happily. This sounds so much like Jezuri to me.
Wow, that's great. So Priyam, in conclusion, I would like to ask you, how are Savitribai Phule's poems still connected with today's women?
The simple fact that her poetry speaks about the importance of education and enlightenment makes it relevant even today. Things may look easier for us than they were for our mothers, and on many levels they are. But the truth still remains that we have much more left to fight for. To paraphrase Frost, we have miles to go before we sleep.
Wow, Priyam, it has been an enlightening session listening to you. I would like to thank you on behalf of all the listeners that you agreed to do an interview with us, from taking time out from your busy schedule. Really thank you for this. It has been enlightening, interesting, and lot to take from it. Thank you so much. So listeners, that was an interview with Priyam Redican, a poet, educator, translator, and also an illustrator. Hope you enjoyed listening to her. We will be back in our next part where Priyam will be performing her set of poems. So do tune in for our next part. Until then, thanks for listening and please stay tuned as our next program follows.